seat. All right. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Great. My name is Alex Pigman. I'm a senior tech reporter at AFP, Agence France Presse, here in Washington, D.C., and it's an absolute honor to be here today to do the closing session of this of the Statistics Forum here at the IMF. I think that we just really need to get straight into it. Our guests, our main guest today, coming from Google, is David Weller. David Weller is the Senior Director of Emerging Tech Competitiveness and Sustainability Policy at Google. And at Google, he's in charge of all the, basically, trade policy, economic policy based out of here in DC. David previously worked as a partner at William Hale, where he advised technology and other clients, and I think on all these issues, which makes him kind of the perfect guest for ending this session, because we have someone who's coming from Google, which is one of the major players in the AI space, who can come here and help us, maybe hopefully try to explain a little bit like where they're going, which is information which is so crucial for everyone in the audience today, whose job it is to sort of try to figure out how to measure that and make sense of that as it makes these huge impacts on the world. And of course, I don't need to introduce Geeta Gopinath, but she'll be here to have a discussion with David, and hopefully with that, with all your expertise, you can maybe get a few of these, a few extra details out of David and Google about where they're headed and what the future, what lies in store for the future. So with that, David has a few remarks to make, and so we will listen to that very closely.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks so much, Alex. Thanks, Geeta. It's an honor to be here. What an amazing event. I think it was about a decade ago that our then CEO said, in the next decade, the sexiest job is going to be statistician and data scientist. I'm not just saying that to butter up a room full of statisticians. He really said that. And I think it's proving to be true. Look, first of all, honored to be here, and we as Google have really enjoyed partnering with the fund over many years on various data initiatives. So really appreciate being invited. Look, Alex, you began by asking sort of a question which I will not answer, which is sort of what is the future direction of technology and Google? I don't think we really know that. But maybe I'll begin with Google's mission, which does remain constant from 25 years ago, and I'm confident in 10 years from now will still be the same, and how it relates to kind of the topic that we're talking about here today. And that, as you may know, is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I don't need to tell, again, a room full of economists and statisticians how profoundly challenging that mission is and why it will never be a solved mission. But I think one thing that makes us, and I think many people across society, very excited about AI, is its potential to help us get there, to enable people everywhere to harness data into information, to harness information into knowledge, and ultimately, on the basis of that, make better decisions. And look, we've all, again, you're all much more familiar and probably have discussed over the past 2 days a bit some of the various range of statistics and estimates as to what the economic impact of AI is going to be, and lots of methodological and probably empirical challenges with that. But I think whether it's somewhat big, very big, immense, I think there's wide agreement that the potential is quite large. And I think it's the nature of the technology that underlies all of those different assumptions. And in particular, AI as a general purpose technology, one of these very rare technologies that comes around a generation or two, and probably the internet was the last one. And economists generally talk about kind of three characteristics for what is a general purpose technology. And I'll just talk a little bit about each factor and apply it to sort of what is technologically happening in the area of AI. The first is broad applicability. Let's see. And really, actually, the first slide I should have put on here would be a picture of a chatbot, which is what I don't think for you all, but for many in the public eye, has become synonymous with AI over the past 2 years. And in a way, it was quite positive that we had the moment that we had a couple of years ago with the release of ChatGPT. I mean, in all ways, it was positive, but in terms of the AI discussion, it was positive in that things that had been happening under the hood for a decade were now kind of being seen. People could touch and feel AI, and so that sense it was good. I think it was bad in the sense that it oriented a lot of the public's mind to thinking a chatbot is what AI is. And of course, it is much, much more than that. I know, again, I think there was some discussion about this over the past couple of days, and being utilized across every industry in an astonishing array of sectors and use cases and countries, whether it's individuals who are maybe unbeknownst to them using AI every day, in directions to get the most efficient route from point A to point B, and in a way that's eco-friendly. That you might see on Google Maps, it says 2 minutes slower, but it's going to save you gas. There's hundreds of data inputs to make that calculation and dynamic inputs, which would not be possible without AI. It's farmers being able to distinguish weeds from plants for pesticide application, financial services companies to detect fraud and counter money laundering, biopharma companies using AI to discover medicines, healthcare providers to better diagnose disease, and the list goes on and on. And so this broad applicability is so core to AI's impact and status as a GPT. Secondly, its capacity to improve. And again, we've had this kind of moment over the past 2 years, but it's really been a decade of pretty dramatic progress in AI for various reasons. And I'll just give a couple of examples. The first relates to, again, I'll just give kind of a product example, translation. And I don't know how many of you remember when Google Translate was first released more than a decade ago. It was a really janky product. It kind of looked like that first translation was the kind of thing you would get a lot, and it was kind of a fun party trick, but not very useful. And it was about 6 years ago when we started applying various different AI models that weren't just looking kind of at the meaning of each individual word, but could look at context and the relationship between words and look kind of backwards and forwards in a sentence, that you were able to get much, much better translation. I'm sure many of you use Google Translate or a service like that now, whether traveling or for work, and it's pretty good. The other example I'll give is less a product example, but just sort of some statistics about what we're seeing in benchmarks based on kind of human expert level performance, and on a number of different areas, different kinds of mathematical capabilities, visual reasoning, linguistic challenges, statistical computation. We're seeing AI meet kind of human expert standards. So I think, again, you read this in the paper every day and you're aware of it, but it's just worth pausing about just how rapid the advance has been as we've had both more data, more intense compute, more capable compute, and smarter algorithms and kind of algorithmic structures that underlie AI systems. And then this is just sort of one other area that I would just call out in terms of the capability improvements that we're seeing, which relate to being able to use much longer context windows. So you have these big large language models, but now you can upload kind of large documents, videos, other things, and ask based on the logic and learning that comes from the large language model to then reason based on it. And this is an example of not using the separate translate product, a very low resource language, and simply based on the large language model uploading a dictionary and a grammar book of that language and just typing in a prompt and asking it for some basic translation, and the system doing a pretty good job. It's kind of amazing. And then kind of the third characteristic of general purpose technology is sort of the possibility of combinatorial innovation and innovation spillovers from one technology to another. You can think of it as sort of cascading innovation, and I think we're seeing this again in many different ways in AI, and we're seeing AI in particular revolutionize how science happens. And sometimes you hear people talk about AI as sort of invention in the method of invention, and so there's again second, third order effects of that. This is just one example of something probably many of you have heard about, which is AlphaFold, which the Demis Hassabis and a collaborative his at Google DeepMind just won the Nobel Prize for the AlphaFold invention. And what's interesting about it in this context is not just it helped us understand biology more, but it has sparked a lot of innovation in various other complementary areas of biology and medicine and material science and many other areas. Oops. So I only have a very few slides, and they mostly don't pertain to what I'm talking about. So you can just look at me, not the slides. Next time I will use Gemini to make better slides. These characteristics, these kind of GPT characteristics, translate into economic impact in kind of two fundamental ways, right? One is, and again, I'm not going to talk too much about this because you're the economist in the room, not me. But one is productivity gains and simply being more efficient with the resources that we have, and the second is new innovation, and that's the thing that is sort of harder to measure, harder to grasp, harder to have foresight over. But given the broad applicability of AI, how it's being used, one can imagine broad new areas of innovation, and you think about prior general purpose technologies where we couldn't have predicted things in the future, right? And you look at how the U.S. labor force has changed. I think it's something like over 85% of people in the United States are in job categories that effectively didn't exist in 1940. So what is that going to look like? And I know the IMF has spent a lot of time on this because it's super important to understand where those impacts are likely to be greatest, how we ameliorate those impacts, how do we make sure we're prepared for where the economy is going. But nonetheless, I think we can all confidently say there is going to be massive new kinds of innovation that we can't quite foresee. So look, the great numbers that I'm kind of alluding to and all of the amazing potential that I'm talking about, of course, doesn't just magically turn into broad, inclusive economic development. I don't need to tell any of you that. I certainly don't need to tell Geeta that, who spent a lot of time really understanding that issue, and I really applaud the IMF for its focus on those issues. If everything that I've talked about would be if it stays in a lab or stays in a couple of companies like Google, it might be interesting. It might make your phone work better in certain ways, but we will have failed miserably as a society, and we will have moved what some people call from a digital divide to an AI divide. I want to just talk quickly about a few things that are, I think, inherent in the nature of AI technology that I think gives us a little bit of a head start on those issues. And I think puts us in a better position to ensure that AI can translate into inclusive development. Much more is going to be needed, and hopefully we'll spend time in the dialogue talking about that. But I just want to talk about a couple of characteristics of the technology that gives me, as I said, puts us in a little bit better position. I think the first is the fact that AI is, in a way, making computing more accessible, right? For the past 40 years, to harness computers, you needed to learn their language, right? And we are now all working towards how can computers more operate in our language. And if we can achieve that, that's pretty profound. And we're already seeing that. I mean, if you're playing around with ChatGPT or Gemini, not just for asking questions, but for coding or tooling or coding or other kinds of tool uses, many other generative activities that you may be using AI for. Now you're not sitting there writing in, JavaScript or whatever language you, Cobalt or I saw the founder of Basic died earlier this week. Whatever your programming language of choice, that was a small group of people who really knew that world. And in fact, on a call recently, our CEO noted that something like a quarter of the code base now at Google is first being generated with AI. So how that operates, I'm not saying coders are not going to be needed anymore, but it's much easier to interact with computers, and that's pretty profound. And then, of course, also translate, as I mentioned, literally the language used to engage is something that AI is helping make easier. Secondly, much of the basic infrastructure that is needed for utilizing AI, at least for an individual and in some cases at an organizational level, is in people's pockets, right? So to some degree, we already have a built-in infrastructure, unlike, say, at the beginning of the internet revolution or the electricity. When electricity was first developed, you didn't have that built-in infrastructure. It had to be built. So you have that here for this technology to some degree. Third, AI itself can help people learn, right? Sort of individualized tutors that can help you learn the technology. So that's another reason, another sort of factor in favor of inclusiveness. Finally, AI is moving much more into sort of a multimodal capabilities. And so, for instance, Gemini 1.5 Ultra, I lose track of the names, that Google released last year was a full multimodal model, meaning that it was actually trained on video, audio, images, as well as text, and the outputs could also be in all of those different formats. So again, making the technology much more accessible and useful. Again, as I said, this is clearly not sufficient by itself. And I know I've been talking on for a while, so I'm gonna wrap up soon. But it's quite clear that both countries, as well as sectors, as well as different communities in countries, are all situated very, very differently in order to be able to take advantage of the power of AI. And the IMF put out this terrific piece of work looking at the preparedness across different regions. And I think it's something that everyone needs to take very, very seriously. I'm just going to flash this for a second, and then I'm going to take a seat because I see numbers flashing, and I don't know whether that means I'm 7 minutes over, or I don't know when it started.
I think we've lost track of time.
Yeah, we lost track of time. That's a bad sign. So let me just wrap by saying there is a tremendous amount that companies, governments, international institutions like the fund, civil society need to work on together to turn what is a very, very powerful technology into broad and inclusive growth for all people. We put out some thoughts a few months ago in a paper that we called the AI Sprinters, the idea being that sort of how can AI be utilized to help countries sprint towards more inclusive economic growth and development. These were some of the ideas that we put forward. Feel free to take a look at it, and maybe in the conversation we'll have a chance to talk a little more about it. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Very much. Thank you very much, David. That is for that overview. So now, just maybe to begin the discussion, I'll just jump right into what you were just talking about, which is the notion of preparedness. And you did mention, the data and that map that we just saw, based on IMF data, where we saw like the dark blue countries are, are often the same dark blue countries when it comes to when it comes to development, when it comes to all the things that come to the richer nations that don't necessarily come to the other ones. I thought we could just sort of drill down on that a little bit. Like, what do you think we can do? What can Google do? What can the international community do to just make those other countries better prepared? Like, what are some specific things we can upskill?
Yeah, sure. So as that slide pointed to, we've thought about it in kind of 4 basic categories and enabling conditions. The first is infrastructure. The second is people and talent. The third is data and data policies, and the fourth is enabling regulation. I could spend just a minute on each. Look, in infrastructure, as I noted, to some degree, we have a lot of built-in infrastructure for AI, but AI requires real connectivity, and connectivity has not been well distributed across the world. There's basic broadband access, which we still have something like a third of the world that does not have internet access. So that includes everything from subsea cables to kind of terrestrial last mile, to sometimes satellite internet, to the data centers that will both train AI, but that also inference on AI systems will work off of. And that is an area where certainly we as Google are doing a tremendous amount of investment. Our capital expenditures over the last 4 quarters have been, it's sort of on a pace to be something like nearing $50 billion a year, and a number of the other AI companies are in kind of similar ballparks or beyond, so kind of astonishing numbers. And that also includes subsea cables. So we just helped build the first subsea cable between Africa and Australia. We've done something called the Equino cable, which is between Europe and Africa. So that kind of backbone is super important, but international financial institutions, gets involved in it, and that's important. On people and skilling, this is vital, and it's both sort of basic digital and AI literacy, but then also workforce and workplace focused AI skilling, and ensuring that people know how to use AI in the context of their jobs, or the AI that they're learning, they're able to then have a pathway to a job. So a huge amount of work on there. We've spent a lot of time on it, but it's very, very hard to get right. And then maybe we'll talk about regulation later, but I'll just say on data, and you're all the data people, so you all get this, right? Like AI ultimately requires learning based on data, and if the data that you're learning on is not inclusive, doesn't reflect, the languages on the internet do not reflect the world. Right? I mean, the vast majority of language on the internet is English materials, and so if that's all you're training on, you're going to have models that are not reflective, and that are going to then be harder to fine tune for local needs. So making sure that we have data, encouraging data to data in sort of global South countries to be more publicly accessible, to be collected, to be publicly accessible, then will enable those countries and others to learn from that data and do things with it.
Geeta, coming to you, one of the watchwords we've been hearing and discussing lately is productivity. There's always this notion, when it comes to AI especially, it's always like it'll increase productivity and all this. And there's a need, the data has shown that there's a need for an increase in productivity. So it would be great, if it was delivered as such. But then there's a problem of measuring productivity. And then there's an extra problem of maybe in the AI world, it's even harder to measure productivity. I was just wondering, how can we kind of bring the whole notion of measuring productivity into the AI world, and so to speak?
Thanks. Firstly, I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because we've been talking about the many aspects of AI and the impact it can have on economies and what kinds of policies are needed. But this is the first time we're having this conversation about how do we measure all of this. And you will see as we talk that we can't do any of the other stuff in terms of policies without being able to measure things correctly. And so why is this measurement issue such a big deal? I can start by quoting Robert Solow, the Nobel laureate, who said, I think this was 1987, when he said, you can see the computer age everywhere except in productivity statistics, which is basically making the point that technology, it's very hard to make sure you're measuring it correctly. We use it all the time. We use Google Maps to get around one place to another much more efficiently, but that's not something that enters GDP, and therefore it's not something that we measure in productivity. A bigger point here is more generally when we think of the services sector, and especially services that that you use, that you get benefits from, but where there is no market price for it. So a whole bunch of government services, be it law and order, be it in many places you have education and healthcare that's provided by governments, and you get a very good service, but there is no market price for it. So the effect of all of that on GDP is measured using inputs, right? So you measure the contribution of the education sector, which is non-market-based. GDP is basically a measure of all the costs of the teachers and the buildings and all of that you need to invest in. You don't have a measure of the value of the output. So by design, you are not going to get productivity to go up with AI. So if we are in a world where we're using AI to improve the teaching, the how children learn, all of that, it won't show up because there's not, except for the initial big investment, you don't have that increase in productivity, output, value of that output that comes up, and therefore you don't measure it in productivity. And this is not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. As long as we've been in this digital world, this has been an issue. But AI is going to supercharge it for all the reasons that David mentioned also, which is it's the general purpose technology, which is going to be used in multiple services that we use on a daily basis. And again, if we can't measure the effect of all of that on output and therefore on productivity, we're going to miss the story over here. So again, I think the wake-up call for all statisticians and anybody else who's working on measurement is that we really need to be able to get an answer on how to do this right. Because if it is truly the case that we're moving to a world where AI is adopted much more widely, we have to fix these measurement issues, and this is going to be critical.
Sort of following up on a different hard to measure notion is the intangible assets. AI is an intangible asset. I was a macroeconomic reporter in Brussels for many years, and sometimes the Irish GDP data would come in, and it would always be a bit of an outlier because some because some major multinational had switched and booked their new patents in that country. I was just wondering, so now with AI, you just mentioned supercharging. It's like, it seems like that potentially could supercharge that same phenomenon. I mean, what data or what measurement, again, could the statistics community hone in on so maybe those outliers aren't happening so often?
Yep. So again, this is another area. It is a long-standing concern that we have had. When it comes to intellectual property, when it comes to intangible assets, we don't measure these things, first of all, very well. In many countries, you don't measure intangible investments. In many countries, and in others you do. So we do, again, in a world where we are using more and more of AI, and you have much more of intellectual property being created, this is going to become an issue. And then, of course, there is this big question of where you go and you want to park your intellectual property. And you could be doing it for multiple reasons, including, for example, depending on the tax jurisdiction that you want to be in. So, the example that you were mentioning in 2015 is one where you had a multinational enterprise that went and moved its intellectual property to Ireland for taxation purposes. And that was a year when it was Ireland, and Ireland's GDP went up by 26% in that year. So here's what the problem was. There was nothing wrong. This was how you should measure things, but this is kind of what happened under the hood, which is, if you take the example, let's take this case as being that of a smartphone seller. So you have, for example, smartphones that are of this particular company are being manufactured in China and exported out of China, right? So a part of that export income goes into China's GDP statistics, and it says export income. But the other part of it, which is attached to intellectual property, is attributed as the export of Ireland. So this company sells a lot of smartphones, and so you have the sudden jump in export income earned by Ireland, which obviously means its GDP goes up by this very large amount. But there's a huge disconnect between GDP going up by 26% and how households in Ireland felt. They didn't feel like they were living in a country where GDP went up by 26%. And so the question is, how do you then get these statistics to tell you what you need to know as a policymaker in terms of what the impact of this? So again, if this happens much more because AI is becoming much more prevalent all over the world, and because companies are moving around their intellectual property to different locations, where we could see more of these kinds of events. So what does that mean for our data collection? Again, we as an institution do a lot of what's called balance of payment statistics. Trade data is absolutely critical. But we need to now make a distinction between, for instance, trade that's being done by multinational enterprises, where you could see more of these kinds of issues, versus trade that's being done by a wholly owned domestic firm. Again, there are other issues, by the way, that are also related to this distinction, but that detail is going to be important. Similarly, we're going to have to keep track of where intellectual property is moving so that we understand what's going on in terms of our data. And more generally, intangible investments is something that more and more countries will have to start incorporating in their statistics.
David, over to you. When ChatGPT came out 2 years ago, the world was marveled, the world was freaked out. And I was just, at a company like Google, I mean, let's just focusing on the people that were, and maybe the regulators that were more freaked out than marveled. One of the big claims is, how can you make sure that this is there's a responsible deployment of AI as it enters the world in all the sectors we've been seeing over the last few days and discussing over the last few days. I was just wondering, what is Google doing to ensure a responsible adoption of AI, plain and simply?
Yeah. So I guess I'd maybe put it in a few different buckets. Maybe the first is sort of our internal policies. So I think it was in maybe 2017, 2018, put out AI principles, which is almost like an internal constitution about what kinds of AI technologies we will pursue and won't, what kind of principles we'll follow in the pursuit of those. And we've built sort of an internal governance system around that. So before we launch any major new AI product, we're assessing it based on that. And there are all kinds of hard problems that come up. I'll give one example. And a number of years ago, we developed a lip reading technology. And the use case that we were developing in the context of was both like kind of dubbing for YouTube videos and also for the disability community. And it has been incredibly exciting to people with speech impairments and others to be able to use this technology. But we also recognize, obvious surveillance implications if you either open source a technology like that or make an API freely available. And there was a lot of debate whether we should deploy this at all or in limited ways. And we ultimately decided not to open an API on it that was freely available. It had to be whitelisted. So that would be one example of the kind of product decisions that I think we and others are grappling with all the time. The second is really grounding our practices in research, both our own and kind of academics and a rich third-party ecosystem that exists around AI responsibility and AI safety, so that we can measure our products and their performance against existing benchmarks, which are rapidly being developed. So that's kind of a second area. And then the third is really working with others in the technology ecosystem and beyond and aligning on codes of conduct and best practices. So again, like one company can do the right thing, and of course I'm going to say this because I'm biased, but I think Google tries to do the right thing on these and on all of these issues, but it takes one bad actor. So we try to align on, for instance, in the context of elections and using generative AI, right? We made a decision, any election ad that uses generative AI has to be labeled as such. But then we also worked with other companies to get all the major platforms to align on that, and there may be a rule for law and regulation on that as well.
Maybe just jumping right on that, law and regulation, what do you see as the good directions to go? Obviously, we have the EU AI Act. There's the Biden executive order. We don't know whether that will last longer. I was just wondering, what is your sort of general sense of regulation?
Yeah, look, I think the comment you made earlier makes this very hard because policymakers tend to either entirely focus on the doomsday scenarios, or they're Pollyannish and like AI is going to solve all problems of all time. We don't need to worry about anything. And so the first principle that we advocate for in regulation is that it be fundamentally balanced and that you're thinking about the opportunities that you need to enable, and you do need affirmative government action sometimes to enable AI to be deployed across regulated sectors, for instance, or to skill your workforce and so on and so forth. But you also need to have the appropriate responsibility pieces. The second is that it should be targeted. I think part of the challenge of the whole AI regulation conversation is AI is not a thing, right? It's an underlying field of science and technology. And so AI used for a small business or a retailer to communicate with its customers is probably something that doesn't need to be regulated per se. A financial service institution using AI to make loan decisions is a different scenario, and there are many things in between. So fundamentally, we think regulation should be targeted on the actual use and application rather than the technology itself. We don't have a Department of Electricity or Department of Engines per se. And then the third thing is aligned. We have countries everywhere in the world regulating on the same set of issues now. It's like the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once is what AI regulation is now. And you have severe risk, and you're already starting to see it, of fragmentation, which is neither good for the underlying goals of responsibility and safety, because there's not kind of an agreed norm, and you don't have good common mind meld on that. And secondly, it becomes very hard for companies. Frankly, it's easiest for a company like Google, but if you're trying to encourage startup activity in companies from a broad range of countries to be aligned, if you have like a fundamentally fragmented, unaligned regulatory structure across all the major markets and beyond, that's a big problem.
Geeta, just sort of following up on that, sticking with the government policy, how can, other than just pure rulemaking and regulations, how can governments try to make sure that AI is benefiting all in society? Is that actually maybe delivering on its promise? And maybe more specifically for the audience here is like, what data is there out there that we can go look for that will tell us whether that's actually happening or not?
Yeah. This is obviously a question that's top of mind for us, which is AI is this wonderful technology that has a lot of promise and a lot of opportunity, but also is disruptive in good ways, but also in other ways where it could be very disruptive to labor markets. In terms of, we have estimates that show that about 40% of jobs in the world are exposed to AI. Now, exposure in and of itself is not bad. You could have good exposure, or you could have an effect where it's of displacement. So about 20% of jobs in the world are in the category where they could benefit from AI, while another 20% of jobs are in the category where you could be displaced because of AI. And if you're talking about advanced economies, we're now talking about much higher exposure rates of 60% as compared to emerging and developing countries. These are big numbers, right? And the concern, of course, is what David said, which is this time around with this technology, unlike, for example, electricity, we think the adoption could be much faster, which means that we may not be sufficiently prepared to deal with the consequences of the disruption that comes with it, as opposed to a slow adopting technology. So what do we need to do? On the regulation front, that's very important. There are all these important questions on ethics and misinformation, hallucination, all of these risks associated with it, and also preventing concentration of the AI technology. All of that is important. But there's a whole other suite of policy issues that squarely are also something the IMF works on that comes into play. So for example, on fiscal policy, right? We have to start thinking early on about what it means to be in a world where if you suddenly see a large displacement of workers, and they need to go through a period where they have to be retrained, reskilled, so as to be able to work better with this technology. What kind of a social safety net do you have? What kind of reskilling programs do we have? We know that all of this has come a long ways, but it's still far from where it needs to be. And so we have to make sure we have the support system in place. Secondly, when it comes to tax policy, we have to make sure that we are not accidentally, inadvertently favoring AI over humans. Now, you could make the argument, we often do that, and we say, well, no, it's okay to favor one kind of input over another because there are so much of social good associated with that input that we should subsidize it. In the case of AI, there's plenty that's good, but there's also the risk associated with it, right? And so we've done some, the Fiscal Affairs Department has done some really nice research looking into this particular kinds of taxes and kinds of support that we're providing to machines versus labor. And in some countries, the tax system is indeed biased towards encouraging investment in machines as opposed to in labor. And so we're asking governments to pay close attention to whether you're doing the right mix over here. Then the financial stability is going to be absolutely critical as you end up, as financial institutions start using AI, whether there's enough stress testing that they're doing, whether there is the risk that we end up with too much of herding because everybody's using the same AI model, and therefore the predictions are all very correlated, and therefore you end up with bigger runs. All of that is something we need to dig into. And to your question on data, the more we can track how much AI is being adopted and how quickly it's being adopted by companies, what that is showing in terms of the impact on wages, on workers, what kinds of tax systems do we have, all of that will be extremely helpful.
Just really quickly, just following up, is there anything that Google can do to sort of help this specifically in providing the data that is necessary to make sure that AI is flowing out to society in beneficial ways?
Yeah. Well, the first is open models, like making technology available to the extent that it's consistent with kind of safety and other precautions. So a number of our models are closed models, but we also have sort of the Gemma family of models that are open, and you have thousands of developers around the world building on top of that. Of course, you hear about Meta and Llama, many building on top of that. The original sort of TensorFlow AI system was something that Google developed and then open source. So that's one piece. The second is data sort of interoperability, if you will. I mean, most of our models are trained on the open web. I mean, that's where kind of most of the training is. But there are other data sets, and to the extent that those can be made available and shared. And then third, and this isn't sort of a Google answer, but this is really sort of a public-private partnership piece. I don't know if you've heard about in the U.S. context something called the NARE, the National AI Research Resource, which has been up and running on sort of an interim basis. I think it's the National Science Foundation, which hosts it and essentially brings compute, data sets, algorithms, and know-how, and makes that available to academics, to civil society researchers, others, so they can play with models. Actually, a lot of this came out of proposal from some Stanford professors at Stanford High, and this is now getting adopted in the U.S. We need actually kind of a global version of this too, because often that accessibility of compute at an affordable rate to play around with these models isn't always available. So the UN high-level advisory body on AI just came out with a big report on AI a few months ago, and this was one of their recommendations, to have some kind of resource like this focused on the global south. So that's another thing we can be working on.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for your time and for those great answers. And I'd like to thank everyone here for a great forum for the last 2 days. And as a journalist, all the work that's being done at the IMF and by all the institutions that are really trying to get us the real data so that we can tell this story in an accurate way is so welcome, and it's so wonderful to see you working so hard and thinking about how to deliver that. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And hand over to Bert.
Well, thank you so much for this interesting closing session. Well, this is the moment we're going to officially close the 12th Statistical Forum. And I'm so glad we chose the topic of AI effect on the economy. It's clear there's a lot of interest in the topic. We were amazed by the quality of everyone here, about the panelists, about the presentations. Very valuable insights were shared. And there was a lot of interest too, not only in this room, but for example, the opening session yesterday was watched by 4,000 people. So there's really a lot of impact of what we're doing these 2 days. So thank you all so much for coming here. So why, as a statistical department, do we organize a forum? Well, basically, we're here to provide data and value for the economists, for the policymakers, inside the fund and outside. And that's why we organized and set up the forum as it is. We started with Susan Etty, describing where AI is now and where it's going. We heard from many policymakers, from businesses, from economists. Well, what are the challenges? What are they up to? And what kind of data they need? And that's what we want, because as statisticians, we want to provide the data that matter. And if Gita says there's a wake-up call, great, we take up the challenge. This is a known topic, and we work on it. It's difficult, but we understand that it's necessary to do that. So what did we learn? We heard that AI is already out there. We know that if we use our own phones. We see that all the time. We get these recommendations by Netflix and by Spotify. But it's also clear that, well, we can more easily write code now. I'm not so sure whether the coding skills are so essential anymore by hiring people, because there's so many tools out there that you can easily make application with it without actually coding. We heard that it already has a real measurable impact, for example, on call centers that are being replaced by bots. But it's also clear that the impact is not completely known. We're talking about productivity, and in some areas it's clear, but especially the large language models will have an impact on the service sector. And as Gita said, well, is there non-market output? How do you measure that? But even if there's market output, how do you separate volume and prices? Well, we need to do that to establish GDP. So, and in order to deal with that, we need to establish our concept as statisticians. When this crisis, I call it the crisis, but that was a real wake-up call in 2015, what happened in Ireland. When that happened, we changed things as statisticians. Ireland introduced something called DNI Star, which basically is the GDP DNI without the effect of multinational enterprises. And we established things like large-case enterprise units that try to study at multinational enterprises. We started to exchange information, how difficult it is on individual corporations, but as statisticians wake up. And I think we also now need to wake up or wake up to the challenge. I mean, our policymakers, our economists are asking us to provide this information on productivity, because then, well, the right policy measures can be taken. And we talked about labor market a lot. Obviously, there are a number of scenarios, jobs being replaced by AI. We talked about white-collar work, but obviously, if AI leads to better robotics, then also blue-collar work might be replaced. So it's our role to measure that. We talked about inequality. If all the AI tools will be open source, then it's different than when they will proprietary, then it will benefit a few, and this is also important to measure. And also the point about AI intellectual property being shipped around the world is important to measure to see its consequences. And that has an impact on what the concepts are that we measure, but also how do we measure them. What I'm glad at is that every session we had, the users, the economists, the policymakers said, we need better data, we need good data. That's clear. We statisticians are not out of a job. We really have to stand up and do our job and get the right data. And that's challenging. I agree with this Google man who said statistician is the most sexy job in this century. It still is, and I'm really happy I chose this profession in 1994, I think, something like that. So what are we doing? Next year we have a new system of national accounts and a new balance of payments manual. And as I said before, now the internet, which was not measured in the last SNA, you were not here in the session, so I say it now, and digitalization, artificial intelligence, they're all features there. So the concepts are all there, how to measure it, how to include it in supply and use tables, how to include it in GDP. But now the guidance have to be done. How do you do that? How do you separate the prediction of AI in software, in data, and how do you actually get the right data sources from that? For example, we had this session on AI pricing, which is quite relevant, but it's very hard to get the data from the companies. So basically, the standards, concepts, the guidance, how do you do things, getting the data and technical assistance to ensure all countries in the world have this data, the producers and the users. So, for example, data as an asset will be part of GDP. So from the new SNA, data being produced will be included in the GDP. But then there are many questions, like the cookies being produced, Joshua Gans, this presentation, will it be part? How do you measure that? There are lots of questions, but that makes our job very interesting. There's a lot of questions to go into businesses, what's actually happening there. So we had some studies that you see the relationship between AI uptake and income, or AI uptake and ratings, like the Singapore example. But AI uptake is so general. So what exactly does that mean? Is that use of natural language processing? Is that machine learning? So what is that? And the way you define AI and the way you ask questions in the service are very sensitive. So there's a lot of interesting research there to be done too. We talked about the environment, cost of energy, taking into account in this productivity analysis. And we talked a lot about the risks, risk on inequality, on privacy. So there's a lot to do. But I'm really happy we had this conference, bringing together the policymakers, the economists, the business world, the academics, statisticians. And we should keep on doing this and work together, because only then we can live up to our task. So I want to finish up with thanking, of course, David, Alex, Gita for ending this statistical forum, but also our MD, DMD Lee, and Susan Ati for the opening session. I want to thank all the moderators and all the panelists traveling here. I'd also like to thank all of you who join us here at the IMF in person or online. It's great to have all these people together, and I think it will be a way to keep on working together. But I also like to thank the team in my own department who did an amazing job in setting this panel up. I know how much work that was. So, well, Jim, Padma, Dragana, colleagues from CSF, ITD, Com, Andrew, Andinet, Arusha, Barent, David, Eurydice, Katja, Laila, Luana, Maya, Nancy, Natalie, Pat, Patricia, Xi, Rafika, and Jinka. Please all stand up and let's give them an applause. So, the last thing we do before we close this forum is, because we had such a great choice of the topic of the forum this year, we want to have your inputs for the forum of next year. So we'll organize a Menti. There will be a QR code on the screen, and there will be some choices what the topic will be of the next forum. And well, we take those inputs into account. And with that, I close the forum, and I hope to see you next year. Thank you so much.